Cool. We're going to talk about if you have an open core application, an application with both open source and proprietary code, how should you structure that? Should you have one or two repos? I'm Sid. I'm the CEO of GitLab. Sid, maybe you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Asim. I'm the founder of Micro, an open source microservices toolkit, and currently working on an open core enterprise version of that.
Yep. And I just saw your tweet literally 10 minutes ago that you were considering splitting it up into one repo for the open source and one for the proprietary code. Yeah. Why was that?
I fundamentally believe that, the separation makes it very clear from a user perspective what is commercial versus what is open source. I know a lot of people, want to put it in one place because it makes it easier to adopt, but I feel like clean separation provides a certain level of clarity, and as long as the core open source tooling is extensible, then that should work fairly well. I think also, as things are evolving right now, I feel like if you can separate the open source from the commercial entity in all forms, that can actually be a powerful thing. I have a feeling, as well as licensing innovation, I have a feeling a lot of people will end up setting up very lightweight foundations or entities to host their open source software, and then fund that through the commercial entity so that the open source becomes self-sustaining, because it in itself is an entity of sorts, right? Like, it is separate from the commercial aspects, but at the same time, the commercial thing leverages it, and yeah, that's how I'm thinking about it at the moment.
Yep. I think we can talk about that foundation thing too. That's another big one. Yeah. And I totally agree. It should be very obvious which code is open source and which is proprietary. And you never want to kind of take open source code and then make it proprietary. Yeah. That's really a no-no. We have the situation as you describe it. We currently have at GitLab. We got a GitLab-CE repository and GitLab-EE repository. And we're spending a lot of time right now to bring it back to a single repository.
Right.
The biggest problem is that people contribute to the open source code, and then the burden is on us to kind of merge that code into the enterprise edition code.
Right.
And that's duplicate work. We do most of the changes, and so our developers constantly have to kind of send two merge requests.
Yeah.
One to add it to one and the other to add it to the other repo. It's a giant overhead, and it's very painful.
So that's an interesting point that you raised there, and I think that's really core to how your development works, right? So if EE is a fork of CE, like if your enterprise edition is a fork of your community edition, and then you're having to duplicate work, that is a problem. But if the core community edition is actually extensible, where the enterprise edition is actually plugins added onto the core, then every change made to the open source project is actually going right back to the enterprise version as well, right? It's this cyclical feedback loop, and that's how I'm structuring my code, where they are separate, but the enterprise edition is actually a layer on top of the open source tooling. So every fix, bug fix, benefit, feature that goes into the open source actually goes into the enterprise as well.
That's you're choosing to put the technical boundary where your kind of commercial boundary is.
Yeah.
That has a couple of consequences. First of all, I think it will be really hard to change the technical boundary later, because you'll get other plugins, and there are applications in our space, for example, Jenkins, that have a ton of plugins, but that also have a really hard time evolving beyond that model. Like, it's hard to make big changes to your application because you cannot test beyond the plugin interface. And this is a giant problem for anything that has plugins, including things like WordPress. The other thing is, it's not always the case that the technical boundary and the commercial boundary are the same. For example, we we took a long time to find out what the boundary is, and we found that the commercial boundary is the intended buyer of a feature. Right. If the intended buyer is no longer an individual contributor, then it goes into our commercial editions, and that has no relation to the technical integration.
Right.
And we found that, for example, the technical boundaries we set between GitLab and GitLab CI, when we eliminated that and made it a single application, it was the single best thing that ever happened to the company. Even though we thought we had such a great way of integrating them, but like they were custom made, each were customized to fit perfectly together, and still having them in a single application was so much better. And now your things are single application probably, but with a plugin interface. But don't underestimate the cost of having that split in between.
I mean, I completely agree with you, and I think it's on a case-by-case basis. The interesting point here is that the product that I am building, the tools itself, were built from day one to be pluggable. That is quite literally the model and the feature, the core feature of the tooling, and that's why it kind of fits into that, because it demonstrates quite effectively. You expect developers and organizations to pick up this open source tool and then extend it with plugins. And the enterprise version is just that, doing exactly that and demonstrating that in a way that's adding commercial value. And then it's kind of saying, look, the thing that you would do to go to production, all these plugins and things that you would add, we're going to provide to you in a prepackaged, trusted, tested, and supported commercial offering. And that's, me having tried a few things over a number of years, over 3-4 years, and feeling like this is the model that might work based on the feedback of the users who are, going to production and seeing, if you see 20 of them all do the same thing, then you kind of go, oh, well, there's a product here. There's something that can be used, but it's not, it's not entirely clear to me. I have a feeling I will learn in time, right? You have to try something and then evolve and adapt. So it could be that there are certain limitations to this model as well. But it's interesting to hear your point that consolidating all of this was basically the single best thing that you could do. My question to you is, like, does GitLab, the commercial entity, own the core open source IP as well?
So to answer your specific question, no, it does not. We have a DCO, a developer certificate of origin. So people keep owning their own copyrights. They just agree to license it under the MIT license. So we removed the CLA, the contributor license agreement, on the request of Debian, who switched to GitLab.
Right.
Maybe I think a fundamental thing of open source is that instead of needing this plugin system, like if you ship closed source software, you need an API to program to because you can't add it. I think the friction has become so low in open source that why make it a plugin? Why not add it to the application? That way you can test it end to end. You make sure all the plugins still work, which is like the biggest thing. Like you upgrade a Jenkins server, Jenkins is going to be fine, the core thing, but the plugins all break. So why not have everyone add the plugins to one code base, and why not stop having plugins? I think another thing you said is, I want the commercial version to be the trusted, the reliable, the thing that always works. I think that hurts adoption of your project. If you download GitLab, whatever version you download, it will work. And we have the same standards for, if you just want the open source code, it is as secure, as reliable, as well documented as the commercial version.
Yeah.
And I think that greatly helped adoption.
Yeah, I think the interesting points that you highlight there is the difference between the types of products that we are working on, right? So the thing that I am working on, if I put all of the features into the single open source system, it would be a piece of bloated software that everyone would have to adopt. And what users kind of say to me is, I only require these specific features. Therefore, I want a very lightweight, performant binary that I can run that's efficient, and that's where that kind of point comes from. All of the majority of these things, they're all still open source. Everyone can pick up the plugins, use them, build something, and adopt it. And so it's all kind of still as performant. But I think the kind of model that I see is, what you want to use as an individual is not necessarily the same thing that's required by an organization. An organization requires something that is, secure, trusted, supported, and that has, all the features that they want. So for instance, if you are a hobbyist and you are building with my tooling a set of applications that all communicate with each other, it is unlikely that as a hobbyist that you care whether that has authentication or mutual TLS or things like that. But if you're an enterprise, it is likely that you are not going to release a production application without those features. And that's how I see that kind of separation. So the point that you make, which is quite interesting, of like the difference between what an individual contributor requires and what a team or company require, that's how you separate what is commercial versus open source. I think in the same way, that's the same for me, except the product is very different. The product is quite literally enabling microservices development, and so every aspect of that features into that, whereas the product that you're developing actually makes more sense as a single monolithic application, because it simplifies quite a lot of that self-hosted kind of Git organization, which I give you full credit for figuring that out and making it as simple and as easy as possible to make that work.
Yeah, I totally agree. Different things have different models, and it's hard. For example, one of our popular two things. One of our popular features have been GitLab Geo, so replicate GitLab. I'm not sure we could have done that as a plugin interface. It needed to kind of hook into some core things in GitLab. And maybe a self-serving analogy is Windows drivers versus Linux drivers. Windows, anyone could plug in a driver. With Linux, if you want to add support for a driver, you have to contribute it to the main code base. And there's pros and cons. But I hear you. And for example, the Node community, like, there were great initiatives to make something similar to Ruby on Rails, but people wanted their stuff way more composable. And that might be especially prevalent with the very early adopters that you have using your software. So I see that.
That's very interesting. Running back to the thing that we talked about, foundations, while you still have some time. What do you think about that? I feel like, previously foundations were these large entities that are host to projects, Linux Foundation being one of the keys, CNCF being another one. In my eyes, as we have this kind of licensing, rebirth, I feel like what we're going to attempt to do is commercial companies are actually going to put their open source code in small foundations that they create themselves specifically for that code, to demonstrate that there is this separation from that. I mean, how do you think about it?
So when we started, we had GitLab.org and .com, a clear separation, 2 blogs, everything. It was a giant waste of time, so much overhead. And in reality, we were the company behind it. So I think it's very important that you have promises. So if you Google GitLab stewardship, you'll find our promises to the community. They will watch every step we take, and they will cry. Well, not cry, but call us out when we make a mistake. And I think that's healthy. So I think if you have something like Kubernetes, which is like needs everyone to contribute, totally makes sense to put it in a foundation. If you have something like MongoDB, where there's one clear company that sponsors the development, a foundation can be a lot of overhead. You see that a lot with Apache projects that have like one company that does most, but they constantly have this naming kind of collision where you have to think of the Apache project and then the commercial entity. And I think it's overhead. And know, I'm a fan of integrated applications by now. So I also am a fan of integrated organizations.
Right.
And that doesn't preclude you like do the right thing. But I think a foundation, when the development is dominated by one company, I don't think a foundation is a guarantee against that. I think you just, there's very few guarantees except the company behaving responsibly and making the right promises. And we, for example, are now considering relicensing our open source code right now.
But where are you thinking of licensing it as?
It's MIT licensed, and there's no plans to change that at this point.
Interesting. I mean, I agree with you on that point, right? Like the overhead, I think there's a certain level of premature optimization. There's a case of, you know, if you are the single contributor, then it makes sense for it to stay within your org. If that scales out, example, Kafka, you know, if you have many, many different contributors, then, you know, it is perhaps in the future, it's not that you have to give it to an Apache foundation. Perhaps it's that you can create a foundation for that is not real, you know, that is controlled by a consortium as opposed to, to these traditional entities.
And I think the time for that is when you see other continuous contributors step up. If it's a whole bunch of ICs doing a couple of contributions, like at GitLab, we're super proud, 150 a month, like great flow of contributions, but not, I could name a company, like CERN contributed a bunch of stuff, but there's not anything even approaching our scale. So I think that I think it's a foundation is really handy when you have competitors. So we have our customers contributing, but they're not in the same business as us.
Right.
If you have a Kubernetes, which is Google, Microsoft, and AWS going head to head, yes, then a foundation is a great way to alleviate the fear. So if GitHub would start contributing to GitLab, then a foundation would make sense.
Oh, that's interesting. I have a feeling you might find other companies contributing to GitLab first who want to build another GitHub or a GitLab style offering, right? That would be kind of interesting.
And that if we start to become competitive, then it might be good to put it into a foundation. Yeah. But I've not heard anybody request it so far.
Just want to be conscious of your time. So, you know, Sid, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you too. I'll stop the broadcast. Thanks for watching.